Hey all, this is David Ducker coming back at you, and today I'm going to be talking about orcs, also known as the Uruk in the language of elves. In Elven tongue, they are known as the Uruk, but you can call them orcs. That's what you can call them. Orcs. Let's start off with their history, because I know I'll forget that if I don't start out with it. So orcs in my game are the descendants of giants who went literally underground to escape the persecution of dragons. Dragons ruling the earth at that point. So certain giants delved beneath the ground to escape them, the masters of the sky, and they became the Fomorians and eventually split off into orcs and dwarfs. And dwarfs, at a certain point in their history, they had virtually forgotten about the surface world, and they decided, though, that it was time to have their great quest for the sky. They had this great hero, a prophet, come among them and say, if we stay here in the darkness, horrible things will happen to us. I have foreseen it. It has been told to me by our God. We need to head upward. We need to find the sky once more that we have forgotten about. So he led the quest for sky, and eventually the dwarfs did come up, and they cut their way up through the earth and came up under the sky. And of course, eventually they split into sky dwarfs and deep dwarfs, and the Darrow, for those who chose to remain below. Horrible things did happen to them. For those who refused the call to sky. But as the dwarfs are tunneling upward, they were driving before them all of the orcs, who were their mortal enemies. As I said, the dwarfs and orcs both descended from Fomorians, the orcs being more wild, the dwarfs being more lawful. When the dwarfs headed up, they drove forth many orcs before them. So, as by the time the dwarfs had reached the sky, they'd already scattered orcs all over the surface world, and now they just drove them out even more so. And the orcs, of course, came into conflict with many races, with humans, with ogres, but primarily with elves. See, the orcs found the forest to their liking, and they came into great conflict with the elves. Elves called them Uruk. They didn't really know what they were, so they just renamed them, basically. Or that's what they call them in their language, at least. So that's how the orcs came to the surface world. And, of course, their impact on elves and what happened to elves because of orcs, that is covered more in my video on elves and in my video on goblins. But that's not the story for today. The story for today is just orcs. So now we know where they came from. They came from the underground. They're more closely related to dwarfs than they are to humans or elves. But now they've come up onto the surface, and they've largely taken root in the forests. I'll stop and mention what they look like in my game. So orcs tend to be tall and muscular. Their skin ranges, usually it's green color. It can go from light all the way to dark green. They do have tusks protruding up from their lower jaw, typically just very small tusks, although they can be fairly large depending. And they have stub noses, flat pig-like noses, sloping foreheads. They don't tend to have a great deal of hair on their head. When they do, it tends to be dark brown or black. They're very prone to baldness, although it's fairly common for them to have quite a bit of body hair. So that's what they look like in my game. Great contrast against the other races. Elves are skinny, dwarfs and ogres are fat, and goblins are fairly skinny as well. And also to contrast in the face, goblins in my game have pointed noses, pointed ears. They tend to have thicker hair and higher foreheads and fangs, whereas ogres, or rather, whereas orcs, I'm getting confused myself. Whereas orcs have tusks, flat noses, sloped foreheads, bald. They do have pointed ears, but they're not high and pointed. They're just very slightly pointed. So you can easily, in my game, tell the difference between a goblin and an orc just by looking at them. So orcs are basically a foil against wild elves or wood elves, the Eladrin, as they are known. So wood elves are forest-dwelling nomads traveling in small family bands. So are orcs. They travel in small family groups through the forest, hunting and gathering for their sustenance. What sets them apart and what pisses elves off is elves have a natural affinity for balance, and they don't do any damage to the forest. They take only what they need and no more. They move on before they've eradicated all the resources from an area. So they do no damage. There's zero impact on the forest. Orcs are like the exact opposite in that sense. They move into an area and suck it dry. They'll eat every animal. They'll hunt every vegetable. They'll eat every animal. They cut down the trees, and they basically despoil the land. And then when they're starting to starve to death, they'll move on to a new area and despoil that as well. So you can see right away why they come into conflict with elves. So orcs are nomadic hunter-gatherers, but they have no natural equilibrium. So they'll move in, they'll set up their little log cabins or stick huts, and they'll just keep cutting trees down. They'll have huge bonfires every night. Fire is sacred to them. When they die, they have to be cremated in order to move on to their afterlife. If they're not cremated, they stay here. They become zombies or ghosts. So fire is tremendously important. Thus, cutting trees down is tremendously important to them. And they tend to overeat whenever possible. So they'll keep hunting and just gathering food for themselves, and they'll keep breeding until the area just can't sustain them. And then they'll split off into many small bands and go out and find their own areas. A swarm of orcs, essentially. And this is also when they could get dangerous if instead of swarming, they might actually just launch a military campaign and try to take over a human settlement or an elven settlement like an elf tree, which usually they don't stand any chance against an elf tree, but you never know, and they could still cause damage even if they ultimately aren't successful. So this is a huge source of why elves don't get along with them. In terms of food, orcs, they're hunters and gatherers. So they eat pretty much anything they can get their hands on, from venison right down to squirrel. They'll eat everything. They typically just roast it over a fire, although they like their meat fairly raw. They do eat vegetables. They'll eat just about anything. And for vegetables, they'll typically throw all the vegetables into a stew pot and just boil that and eat that. It's kind of a vegetable stew. And they might put some meat in there as well, but they like to eat their meat kind of by itself and have the vegetable soup by itself as a side dish. They typically lack the ability to bake bread. It's just not worth their time. So they'll throw any raw grains they can get into that vegetable stew. Clothing, typically leather. They love to wear leather, usually brown leather. And furs. They love fur cloaks, fur boots, fur gauntlets. They love fur. So very much this barbarian kind of appearance. Beads and buckskins on them. Now, because they're so primitive, left to their own devices, they would probably only have stone tools, stone axes, stone arrowheads for their bows, stone spear tips. But because they're so aggressive, they often come into conflict with anyone they meet, and they'll steal everything they have. I mean, they'll kill them first, but then they'll take everything. So their armaments will range wildly. If they've been fighting elves, they might even have some mithril that they've taken from them. If they've been fighting humans, probably they'll have iron. They could have steel from either one. So their weapons and usable equipment, if left on their own, very primitive. But because they come into so much conflict, they'll typically have a mishmash of different goods from humans and elves. In terms of politics, like their government, it's very, very much tribal bands. The biggest, strongest orc is their leader. And if any other orc thinks that he can knock that guy off, they'll fight. Typically it's non-lethal, barehanded, wrestling and brawling, just until one of them quits. Ogres have a similar system where they wrestle each other, but it's a very formal style of wrestling. Ogre belt wrestling. Check out the video on ogres for that. But orcs, they don't have any rules, no holds barred. It's just that usually it's got to be empty-handed. So no weapons except, your fists and your tusks and, feet, knees, elbows, whatever they can throw in there. That's what they're going to do. So orcs are great unarmed combatants. Other than that, as far as their preferred weapons, even though they're not making them themselves usually, but they do prefer axes, because axes can cut down trees, as well as cut down opponents. So axes are definitely the favored weapon of orcs in my game. They're pretty good with bows, not tremendously, but they do use them. Throwing axes, of course, very, very useful to them. So if they have a signature ranged weapon, it's probably, again, throwing axes. They're a little axe crazy, both in personality and in weapon preference. In terms of magic and religion, very primitive. They might have some druids, shamans, medicine men, maybe even some sorcerers among them, especially tending towards fire magic, as fire is sacred to them. But very much on the primitive side, nothing really organized like a big church that a high elf or a goblin or a dwarf would have, or even a lizard folk. Very, very much primitive animal worship, spirit worship, fire worship. So very primitive in that regard. In terms of like a rogue, they might have some primitive snares and traps as well. It's not well looked upon, but if it's effective, it could come into play. They don't have a lot of scruples. They do have some honor, but they are all often willing to violate their honor if it means the difference between life and death. Which, hunter-gatherer society, hunting does mean the difference between life and death, so trapping could be a big deal for them as well, depending on the tribe. One tribe might be more honorable and one less honorable. So that could be a great way to contrast different orc traditions as well. I often run orcs with a big penchant for branding themselves as decoration, as body art, as well as ritual scarification. So they'd be pretty big on that, which again contrasts them well with goblins. Goblins only brand their slaves, so orcs brand themselves. So, what does that mean for how goblins view orcs, But orcs don't typically, because they're so ferocious, so angry, they're so pumped up on testosterone, they're typically not taken as slaves because they'll typically fight until they're dead before they get captured. It's not to say there aren't any orc slaves, it's just fairly rare. So ogres might take some, and goblins might take some, but not very many, just because they're so hard to deal with. And those that are taken, I mean, they're hard to train. Orcs are not particularly bright, and they have very short patience and very quick tempers. So This combines to make very poor slaves even when they are taken. They're good for gladiators. They're not very good as guards, but passable, and they can be used as soldiers to a degree. If they're used as cannon fodder, they're great. But trying to get them to fight in a disciplined formation is virtually impossible. So, again, that contrasts very well against goblins. Goblins are extremely dangerous in a disciplined formation. That's how they prefer to fight. So orcs, very, very different from goblins. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to cover with orcs. Food, shelter, clothing, government, military, religion, magic, traps. I think that's about it. I will mention that they don't take slaves. So even orcs, in some ways, have certain standards. So they think slavery is evil and wrong. So at least orcs have certain morals. So they don't front to goblins and ogres because they take slaves. They'll appreciate an ogre for his strength, and they'll appreciate a goblin for his skill at battle. But orcs will look down on them as slavers, and orcs think that's just disgusting. So I think that's pretty much it for orcs on how I run them. You can get a lot of good story lines out of orcs. They're not the most complicated race, but you can still get a lot done with them. Just imagine a wood elf that's pumped up on testosterone, basically, and then you've got yourself an orc. So I'd love to hear how you run orcs, what you do with them in your game, the old Uruk, and leave that in the comments below. And I'd love your thoughts on what I do with orcs as well, or any anecdotes about fun orcs you've run into, even just individual characters. I always love to hear comments of any kind. But for right now, I'm going to be signing off. Everybody have a good day.